Well, thank you guys for being here. We'll go ahead and get started, and as other people enter the room, we'll just kind of welcome them in. My name is Leisa McDonald, and I founded an organization last year in July, and I'll tell a little bit more of that story, called Matthew House, to work with the refugee and immigrant community. But prior to that, I was living in Indianapolis, Indiana, working for a corporate company, doing, raising kids. Had the opportunity to travel to Lebanon and had my first encounter as an adult working with the refugee community and getting to hear stories. And God just really convicted my heart in that particular encounter. So fast forward a couple months, we moved here to the Phoenix area, and my thoughts about that kind of got put on hold a little bit as I was living my own changing cultures. Anybody from Midwest know what it's like to change cultures to
I lived
the
in
Wild
Michigan
West?
for 10
Yes.
years, so a little reverse, but yes.
Yeah, you understand. Coming from the Midwest out here, it's a little bit of a culture change. But so in that transition, in that period of time, God continued to do a work on my heart. And a couple things that He helped me see and understand was, one, His heart for the nations, which I hadn't understood before. So those of you who know Jake Embleton, who's part of the MissionConnexion lead team, we were on staff together at Central Christian Church, and that's how I began to first hear about God's heart for the nations and what that really meant, and again, just changing that biblical narrative about we must always go and be missionaries in other places, to beginning to understand that sometimes God upends things and He brings people to us, and we can still be missional in our own backyard. And through that time of meeting refugees in Lebanon and trying to figure out, is there ever an opportunity for me to go over there and be part of that, and realizing that's not what God had in store for me. But now being in Phoenix and seeing that we're one of the largest welcoming states for refugees in the United States, there was plenty of opportunity to engage with the nations that were coming to our backyard. And so that was kind of how my journey started in this process, but the opportunity to just be a welcomer and to really engage with families and learn their culture, understand their faith background. I learned a lot about Islam in this time period, in this journey, and then getting to just see how God can use the church to show love to other people has been really, really powerful. So that's a little of my background. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about each of you, so that, again, through the course of the next 45 minutes or whatever, we can make sure you walk away equipped with something meaningful, either for the part of the city that you live in, the part of the state you live in, or maybe what God's doing within and through your church that looks a little different than maybe today. So, Ed, I'll start off with you. I know you said you are from Flagstaff area, came down. Tell us a little bit about what you do and what you're looking for out of this workshop today.
I'm an audio technician. I work with a ministry called Global Recordings Network. We've made materials for reaching out into other countries all over the world with 6,000 different languages we have recorded. So missionaries, people going on short-term trips, can take something that audibly communicates in the language that people speak, while they might be doing some humanitarian type work or something there. At this stage in my life, I've been working with refugees because a lot of those people are coming in here. We already have audio materials in their languages that could relate to them in where they were. But I've started doing some special recordings for displaced people. And one of the recordings is called Welcome to the United States of America, because as you know, and everyone knows, it works with people that are coming in as victims from someplace else, are not necessarily greeted as warmly as they're needed, and understanding what they've gone through. So this helps break that ice. So what I'm looking for is people who are already working with refugees, who have language speakers that I can actually work with and make material in their languages to welcome the rest of them coming after them.
Awesome. Well, that's good to know. Thank you for the work that you're doing. Appreciate that. Right.
Well, I go to Palmcroft Church in Phoenix, and we were given about 10 months ago, maybe a year ago, the name of a family, a refugee family, and because when the bomb blew up, one family ran one at the airport. They all got on the plane, and some got left, some made it. I gave them my car, and I got one of them a job working with me, and so the other one is kind of looking. They just lost the rent that the government was providing, we got a good paying job, $25 an hour, and a lot of overtime, as much as he wants. So
That's great.
good benefits. And they got 2 vehicles. Our class donated to one of them was mine, but it didn't work very good. So we've been working on it.
Yeah.
But
That can build skills too.
yeah, and bicycles, and we've done fun things with them, and I've shared other family members with them. So of course I want to reach them. The end game is to reach them, and I figure if I don't reach the parents, the kids are getting a good taste of Christianity. They've actually visited our church and presented their story in our adult Sunday school class.
Awesome.
That helped get a van. I told them, come, pull on their heartstrings and tell your story. So, yeah.
It is a way to get people to soften, right? To
Yeah.
hear the story and all of a sudden it's not this far off. It's in your neighborhood and these are human beings, and you start looking and you're like, you can see more things that you can relate to, and we have commonality. So I love that you invited them to tell their story. And I love even more that your church responded with the family.
Yeah.
Well, welcome. Well, thank you. What are you hoping to gain for today?
Well, I'd like to know a little bit. I talked to one gal that had a church in Turkey, and she said, I just told the Muslims there how much Jesus loved them. And that's how we built the church. We never criticized their faith. So outside of that, I'd like more insight into that.
Perfect. Great. Thank you for that information. How about you?
Well, I mentioned I used to teach English. Well, that all dried up, and so my contact with refugees is kind of dried up. But I know there's this community, and I just got to go there, and then maybe like Jeff said, to be more intentional. So that's what I hope to get.
Great. Thanks. Remind me your first.
That's okay, Marcel.
Marcel.
I pretty much already told you guys, so.
Yeah. So what are you hoping to gain from today?
Not really sure, to be honest. I don't have a specific goal. Just kind of,
Well, then I can't disappoint you, right?
that's right.
Perfect. And what is your name?
Connie.
Connie. So
Yeah.
tell us a little bit about what brought you here and maybe your experience with refugees.
Sure. I'm a stateside missionary with Ethnos 360, formerly called the Transition, and I'm going to be working at their home office in Florida. Still have a heart for the unreached, and just knowing that refugee needs and ministries is a really great option to keep working towards that. So just looking to be more exposed. I really don't know much about it. I've been a language helper to friends before, and so have dabbled in that a bit, but just want to learn more. Hoping there's similar opportunities in Florida.
I'm sure there are.
Yeah.
They're awesome. They used to be one of the larger states too, so between Georgia and Florida. And I didn't get your name. What is your name? Sorry, behind you, Lisa.
That's you.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, my name is Jimmy.
Jim.
I've been at the Chinese church in Leisa for 20 years. So recently, next year I'll be starting to be a deacon on local outreach.
Okay.
Outreach. So I think is Joe in the organization?
Joe Carruthers or Boysen.
Boys.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
So
Carruthers
he's
is the other name.
Yeah, he's in my church, and 2 weeks ago, we had a barbecue at our church, and we brought a family that just came like a week before that, and then a couple of cousins that are single. And just talking to them, all of them were from Congo originally, and then when the Civil War broke out, the single young men, both of them lost their parents. One of them lost his only siblings, and very interesting. And then since Joe was trying to give him right to church on Sunday, I ended up giving them the family right to the church. And then I talked to Joe about, what do they need, and they had a list of stuff the material stuff that he needed. And so I asked around in our church for somebody responded and said, "Oh, I have this," and I have some another kind of stuff. Another person said there's also we have this furniture we can give away. And so last week I've been just driving them back and forth, running errands, getting stuff from various people. But an interesting thing was yesterday we actually got them a set of like a complete couch set, and as well also a complete dining set. Really, really good stuff. And as it turned out, the people who donated, they were refugees from Cambodia decades ago.
What a beautiful story.
So it's sort of like God's love is continuing. And that guy used us, and a couple of other people from church also came with the truck and helped them move. So it's just like, wow. but now my question is, I know that they might have physical needs, but I think there are also other, because Joe told me like they need a lot of help as far as to get themselves up and running and become independent. So I'm just trying to get an idea of like in what ways we should help out, not just like giving them stuff, but also helping them to on their spiritual journey as well as how to become American, to live in the U.S.
I appreciate that. I happen to know the two young men that you're talking about.
Okay.
So
Okay.
I saw them Thursday night at our class, so they're part of our community, and they're neat young men. And I have not met Casmiel's aunt and uncle who just arrived, but I'm looking forward to hopefully meeting them sometime.
I think the family are Christian.
Yeah.
The two young men, one of them I think is the other one, I'm not sure.
Great. I'm sure each one of you have individual stories, so I'll start with you. If you want to.
Yeah, and quickly, we're Bob and Heather Gardner, so our son Mason, and we're here today because Mason, he leads global missions at Relentless Church over by GCU. We've been churchmen, churchgoers for a long time, involved in ministry, but never really involved in missions. Mason's been on a couple trips to Turkey and Mexico, and he's braver than us. And, so I think for Heather and I, we're very interested in maybe getting a little bit out of our comfort zone. We've always worked within the church in groups with people we know, and our heart, is maybe stretch ourselves and learn to reach out as, the gospel talks us to reach where we're getting that a lot from Mason. We're all called to take it out to the world. So we're just, we're looking asking God to tell us where we fit in.
Awesome.
What he said.
I was going to say, do you have anything you want to add to that?
No, that was pretty good.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And Mason, I know you're obviously on staff at a church,
Yes.
so you have a little different perspective maybe, but what is it that you're hoping to gain from today?
So I oversee global outreach at the church, and we've been able to connect with some families and stuff that are just in our area. Just around GCU, there's a lot of refugees that come to that area and live there. But I think even the more we get into it, it's the more we realize how much there is to learn and just how much there is still to know. And so I think just still looking for just practical, how can we better engage families and people and stuff, and also just looking to partner with other people too. We're a small church, 40 people, so it's we know we can't do it alone, and so who is working there that we can work with and partner with too is really big for us.
Excellent. Well, I appreciate that. Well, the thing that has been fascinating hearing each of your stories is everybody comes at this from a little different perspective, but oftentimes a common heart of wanting to care for our friends from other places. And just some real quick things before we get into how the church can engage. One, we're at a really, really heartbreaking statistic. When I used to lead this effort at Central Christian Church, it was always like painful to share numbers, but the numbers have continued to grow and escalate pretty dramatically over the last few years. So when about 20 years ago, the number of displaced people around the world sat at about 12 million. Today, in 2022, that number crossed for the first time over 100 million mark. And that's a lot of people that have been forcibly displaced from their home. And forcible displacement means that they don't have a choice, right? They can't stay. And it can be a variety of factors. It can be everything from persecution, it can be war, or it could be something even like a natural disaster or famine in the land. But given that high number, it means that there's a lot of people who have lost that sense of connection to home, lost a sense of connection to culture, lost a sense of connection to the things that give us safety and security. And that's an important thing to keep in the back of our minds as we think about what we're called to do as the church, as we work with the refugee and immigrant community. So when we talk about refugees, they actually fall under a very unique class within that 103 million. There's now 33 million that are registered as refugees. They are in that class of people who have been persecuted for one of 5 areas, either a political, religious, social. Those are the types of things that lead to people being persecuted, not being able to stay in their home country. They often flee across the border into another country looking for safe harbor. And when they go into that other country, that's where they have the opportunity to register as a refugee. Again, one of the other humbling statistics with that is today less than 0.25% of those families ever get the opportunity to go to a third country and actually begin to rebuild and reestablish that connection. I mentioned I was in Lebanon in 2012, and I actually was there just at the beginning of the Syrian conflict. And so at that time, the number one people group that was coming into Lebanon looking for safe harbor were actually Iraqi refugees. And they were leaving, and this was what kind of caught me and started shifting my worldview a little bit about refugees. They were actually leaving because when we ousted Saddam Hussein, and I say we because we're all Americans sitting in this room, when we ousted Saddam Hussein, we actually helped put a new government in place, and Saddam Hussein had actually been friendly to Christians. The new government we helped establish was no longer friendly to Christians. And so the people that were fleeing were Christians who were having to leave their homes for their faith. And so when I sat in Lebanon and I heard stories of people who were much like myself, people who loved Jesus and didn't want to denounce their faith in Jesus Christ just for security in their country. They were willing to flee and leave home because of their belief in the same Jesus that I knew and loved. And so it was a very humbling conversation to sit with people who had left businesses, who had been doctors, lawyers, again, professionals of all varieties, who had homes, who had cars, and now were living in poverty, but it was because of their faith in Jesus Christ. So that was kind of a shock. What it then transpired, obviously, moving forward in that story in Lebanon was the number of people from Syria that crossed the border. Those were people who were Muslim. But what's powerful about the call that we have as the church, and I got to first see this in Lebanon, and then I hope to see it, play out here on our own soil, was in Lebanon. If you know their history and background, the Syrian government had actually come in and been a militarized force during their civil war. So Muslim military men from Syria had come in and had killed many Christians, had persecuted many Christians within Lebanon, but yet here was the church, not only forgiving and loving their neighbor, but loving truly their enemy, and actually stepping into a place of really living out that call of biblical, like, how do we love our neighbor well? How do we welcome the foreigner amongst us, even when the foreigner was at one time my enemy? And it's been a compelling storyline as I've worked with refugees in our own community, and we've heard our own political conversations over the last few years. What is the church's role if the church in Lebanon can welcome their enemies, people who potentially killed family members, and they can actually welcome them and care for them as neighbors, as in the image of God, people that they can love and care for, then how do we not, as Christians, when we have families coming across our border or coming into our country as refugees, how can we not also demonstrate that same level of love and care? And so it's been a beautiful opportunity to see the church in action in other parts of the world that have really compelled me to lead in this space. What does it look like for the church in North America? What does it look like for the church in Arizona? What does it look like for the church in Phoenix to step up and step into this? So I had the opportunity when I was at Central Christian Church to actually work with the refugee program there. And during that time, we were, again, engaging people from other churches, but it's really hard. You probably know this, being involved in a church, it's really hard to go to someone else's church and do the work at someone else's church. And so the conversation was had over and over, should we just not launch a nonprofit? And the beautiful part of that is we launched last year in July. And when we launched in July, the Afghan crisis hit in August. And families started arriving in September. And so because of the work that we had done as the church, we were able to actually build relationships amongst a community of churches, and those churches stepped in. Mason was one of the individuals that had the opportunity to come and serve in Chandler, and knew others that came and served at the hotel in Chandler. But it was the church that got to be activated, mobilized, and got to serve. And it's the church today that is coming alongside those families. One of the things one of my favorite stories, and I'm going to read a part of this for you because it's not a story we often think of. I'm going to ask you in a second maybe what your favorite passages are of scripture related to the immigrant and refugee amongst us and our call to love them. But this passage actually comes from the book of Ruth, and it is chapter 2. So it's a little, if you have your Bible and you want to follow along, you're welcome to do so. But the thing that I've loved about this story for a long time is if you look in Old Testament, we're called to care for and welcome the stranger. The Israelite nation was called to welcome the foreigner and care for the foreigner and treat them just like the rest of the nation. And in this particular story, you'll hear one way in which that was done. And so I'll start with verse 2. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor." And Naomi said to her, "Go ahead, my daughter." And so she went out. She entered a field and began to glean behind the harvesters. So two things. Naomi, this was her homeland, right? But for Ruth, she's now an immigrant in this community, and she is getting the opportunity to see, are God's people faithful in the call to leave that space around the edge of the field for them to glean? And so she happened upon a field by a man named Boaz who was actually honoring God's call. So as it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. Just then Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. "The Lord be with you." "The Lord bless you," they answered. Boaz asked the overseer of his harvesters, "Who does that one young woman belong to?" The overseer replied, "She is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi. She said, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters.' She came into the field and has remained here from morning until now, except for a short rest in the shelter." So Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along after the women." So we get to see a beautiful picture of Boaz, not just welcoming in the sense of, "Hey, come on in, you can be part of, sure, glean at the edges of my field," right? What title did he use when he spoke to Ruth? Daughter. He called her daughter. So this concept of biblical kinship, that our friends coming from across the world are coming into our community, not just as, again, someone as a refugee from another country or an immigrant from another country, but that biblical call to kinship. He welcomed her as a daughter. And then he goes to say, follow along. So it's not just, I'm giving you the title of daughter, but I'm telling you to follow along behind these women, watch the work that they're doing, do what they're doing. And then he goes even further. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you, and whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled. So he's caring for her, not just in the sense of, hey, you can come in and clean the field and take care of yourself, but he's also asked the men to be protector of her and not touch her and not harm her, and he's giving her access to water and supplies. And he goes on, she asked him the question, why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner? So she's recognizing I'm being treated not as a foreigner, not as someone who's outside, but I'm being welcomed in. Why are you doing this? And this is the hope we have that we get to offer to our refugee and immigrant friends. When we welcome them in, when we care for them in such a unique way that we treat them as family, not a project, not someone to care for and to say this is over here for you to go do and take, let me point you to this organization or this group, but to actually welcome someone in is a deeper connection. And so he responds, I've been told all about what you've done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with the people you did not know before. So I'm going to fast forward real quick, and he said to her, as she left, or he said to his men, let her gather among the sheaves and don't reprimand her. Even pull out some of the stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up and don't rebuke her. So he didn't just hand her things, right? Like it was come in, he called her daughter, he cared for her, he asked for protection over her, but then he also gave instruction to the men that he was working with in the fields, allow her the dignity to do the work that she came to do, which is collect food to take back to her mother-in-law. And so those are some of the principles that I really encourage people when they're working within the refugee space to keep in mind and perspective. Foreigners, when they come into our country, there's oftentimes thoughts of, well, they're here to take away our jobs, they want to just, make things better for themselves, but most people who are arriving here didn't choose to come here because they simply wanted a better life. They're typically fleeing some pretty horrific circumstances, and when you give them the opportunity to share their story, as we heard from Marcel earlier, those stories are deeply traumatizing, and there's a lot of loss and grief that have taken place in them. Just like in the situation with Ruth, who had lost her husband and was coming as a widow into that community. She lost her husband, she was leaving her family and her home. She was connected to a person that was a loose relationship, and anybody who has in-laws knows that those aren't always the best relationships in the world. But she chose to come with her mother-in-law, honor her, and be in that space. And Boaz is a great example of what it means to show biblical care and community for the refugee and immigrant amongst us. So I share that story because there's a variety of ways in which the church can respond and provide support. So I've got a handout here that you can take. We'll talk through the front side of it, and then we'll kind of personalize it in the back. You'll pass them down the rows. So the first step, and again, we did not hear this in the story of Ruth and Boaz, but the first step I would say for us as Americans is always to take time to pause and learn, right? If you don't know the background of why refugees are coming into our community and you don't understand the storylines that are happening around the world, the best way to get started is to take some time and learn. And there's a variety of ways that we can do that. We can start with books that might be educational. We can start with resources like a movie or a documentary that might have some information. So that's that head knowledge kind of thing. There's a program in the Phoenix area called Phoenix Refugee Connections. They offer a Refugee 101. It's an educational, biblical-focused how do we care for our refugee neighbors, but it's an educational opportunity to learn and understand the circumstances, the process, because one of the things that a lot of people don't know is what the government covers and what the government provides help with, where those limitations, where that starts and where it ends, and what the limitations are of that and the impacts on the families. And so it's a good opportunity just to learn. How many of you have read the book When Helping Hurts? Anybody read that? Yeah. So that's another book I always encourage people to pick up and read. Not just books about the refugee experience, but also books like When Helping Hurts, to make sure that we as individual parts of the body of Christ don't do damage along the way, because we try to do too much, or we do for people instead of with people, and don't provide them the opportunity for dignity. And so that's the part of the story that I love with Boaz, where he's saying, let her glean and let her pick these things up for herself, because that's giving her the dignity to be providing for her family. And so we want to be able to offer that likewise. The other thing I highly encourage is, if you've never been, if you're in, and it doesn't sound like anybody's necessarily in this room in this situation, but if you've not had cross-cultural interactions with refugees or in immigrant communities in our city or in the city in which you live, find a community, even an ethnic restaurant, right, that might be owned by a refugee or immigrant, that gives you more of that culture and an understanding of flavor differences, activity differences in families. There are quite a few here in Phoenix, and especially in the Glendale, Central Phoenix area. There are quite a few refugee-owned restaurants and businesses, and so even just going and having an opportunity to sit, have conversation. The other experience, if you get the opportunity, is to go to a church that is an ethnic-based church. So again, there are quite a few diaspora churches around the city, and so, and I'm sure in any city in which you live, you can find a church that is a ethnic church that has a different way of worship, a different culture. And if you are so inclined, the other opportunity is to always go to a mosque and go sit in a mosque and listen and hear and experience that. So those are some ways I encourage people to get started. There's some other ways in here. There's investing financially in organizations that are doing the work, engaging by serving. You'll notice one thing on here I don't talk a lot about until we get down to number 5 in leading, and that is collecting donations. Jimmy was talking about this a little bit, and he said it very well. He said, I'm sure they have more than physical needs. And so while they're providing for the tangible needs with household items and goods, which are oftentimes very necessary resources, I've seen a lot of churches get involved from that perspective, but never cross the line into building relationships, right? It's always we're going to provide this thing, and we're going to take donations, and we're going to give those, but we never take that next step into how do we build a relationship. So one of the things we try to do at Matthew House is, if a church is going to step into a donation, like at Christmas time, I have a church in Peoria, of all places, that is going to be building stockings for our English class. And so we have an English party or Christmas party scheduled at our English class in December, and they are going to come with some of their community members and help distribute those stockings. So it's an opportunity for them to connect, but they're also connected to a family in that area. They'll provide those stockings to that family as well as to other English classes. So those are some ways that people can get involved, just very tangible, practical ways that people can get involved. When we launched Matthew House, one of the beliefs that we had was we wanted to be highly relational. There were already resettlement agencies doing the work of helping people get connected to housing, get connected to jobs, and get connected to the resources needed to support themselves in the United States. And Sean and I were talking earlier about the English class that is state funded, called Friendly House. It's a program that the state funds, so there's even a language class. But what's often missing in that is relationship. So there's a caseworker, but people get new phone numbers, they're not connected to their caseworker. The caseworker, again, is super transactional. doesn't respond to their calls, doesn't help meet needs. And our hope through our efforts is that we actually build relationship. It's our number one value. So it's less about the transactional piece of it. Yes, we want to help people learn English. We also value education because we know that's what truly helps people become self-sufficient. But we want to bring relationship. And what we love to do is partner with churches to do that, because we want churches to have that relationship, to be able to provide that hope, much like I talked about our friends in Lebanon were able to do, is, answer that question, why are you doing this for me? Why would you as a church community, knowing that I'm Muslim, come alongside and do this for me? And that's the hope that we get to share, is our understanding of who Jesus is and what that compels us to do, not out of obligation, right, but out of wanting, because we're loved, they're loved, and wanting them to see that love and understand that. The other thing a lot of these families lose when they come here is community. So when churches can come alongside, again, if it's just you, as well as some other members of your church, and it's not your church mission, right? So it's not always a outreach pastor or a global pastor that leads this effort. Sometimes it's an individual within a church that says, hey, come. And I don't know at Palmcroft if your church outreach is actively involved in this, or if it's been members of your community that have led your
Somebody
effort.
contacted I don't know if it was your group or somebody contacted our mission director, Mike and Donna.
Oh, Buckles?
Yeah.
So you are working with one of our families too?
Yeah.
Mayhan and Delor. Yeah.
Mayhan works, Mayhan Delor and Zohaija and the kids, Abdul, Saif, and
Yeah, that's awesome.
we have a lot of fun.
Yeah,
But Mayhan works with me now, so he's the one that got the 25. He works every day. Give me
he's
out.
such a hard worker.
And our boss was in Afghanistan, so that was helpful, fighting with the army. So he was excited.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
And what a beautiful connection. And so this is where, as a church, the opportunity to be relational can lead to transformation, not only in the life of the family, because again, equipping them and helping them become self-sufficient, connecting them to resources, and again, people that love them for them, right? One of the things that when people ask to volunteer with our organization, and they're part of a church and they want to, and their number one goal is, I want to reach Muslims, then I may or may not be as eager to bring them in, because the goal isn't that we're converting people to Christianity, right? The goal is that we're building that bridge from understanding their faith and what they know today, and being the hands and feet of Jesus in such a way that it opens doors, but not necessarily forces the issue, right? So there's always that challenge of how do you balance that and do that well. But I have seen over and over and over again when people from the church simply lead with love, and much like Boaz in the situation, the story that we talked about, provides that care and welcomes people as family. I mean, you know the story of Moab at that point in time. They were not friends. Like, Moab was not considered a friendly nation. And so here was this woman, even though she was connected to Naomi, doesn't mean that people are going to welcome her as a friend, right? But he not only welcomed her as a friend, but he welcomed her as family. And just that extension of care means the world. And so I trust that, and one of the reasons I know that your team has done a great job, and your community and church have done a great job, is I don't hear from Mayhan and Delaware very much anymore. And I used to hear from them a lot. So that's always my check of
You've
success.
been in their house. I keep thinking I've met you there once. A long time, quite a while ago.
Yeah, right when they first moved in, maybe?
Yeah.
So they, that's one of the things that we try to do. And again, other organizations are set up differently and have different programs, but we offer welcome teams. So Donna led the welcome team from Palmcroft that got them connected to this family. And I knew Donna from Lutheran Social Services or Refugee Focus when she worked there. But we want welcome teams, and we want that community to come alongside. And again, when it's a church community that comes alongside, it's beautiful to see, again, church communities change because they've gotten a connection, and the hospitality that typically is offered back to that church community extravagant. And I say extravagant because I know most of these families are on food stamps, and the extravagant just generosity that they show to us as their friends is super powerful, and just a reminder of what biblical hospitality is supposed to look like. So these are just some practical ways. You guys, many of you have worked with refugee communities, so what are some other suggestions or other thoughts that you have to add to this list, or other ways that you would encourage? Or maybe the question is like, so I'm in a community and I don't know how to get plugged in and how to begin any of these things. You're welcome to ask that question too, and I'll see if there's an organization I can point you to or a connection I can help make for you. But any questions or comments?
Does your organization do, I couldn't quite figure out what you're saying when you're saying the welcome team. So do you connect your people that come to you like with a church family that can come alongside of them? Okay, so do you know about the Good Neighbor program that some refugee resettlement companies do?
Yes, so World Relief runs Good
I know
Neighbor.
World Relief does that. I worked with them for a couple months in Seattle, but I didn't know if any of them did it around here, because that's a great opportunity for churches to come alongside of refugees and be their family here and their connection. And, you know, other than, like you were saying, like the organization does all these things for them, but to have an actual family that, you know, invites them for Thanksgiving dinner and, you know, teach them how to ride the bus and, you know, how to shop at the grocery store and not get taken advantage of.
All those things.
All these different
Yeah.
things. So, so it's really great, and they make, you know, good relationships, good friendships within those communities. So it's usually like a community group that wants to do it from the church, kind of like what you're doing in a sense.
Yeah, and we try to run those through churches, but quite honestly, it can be, to your point, a group of community members who are all like-minded and willing to come alongside one another and provide that support and resource for families. We initially launched in the East Valley to try to bridge gaps and divides that we were seeing out in this part of the community. There were, in fall of last year, 2021, up to that point since 2016, since my involvement with the refugee community in this area, we knew of about 15 families that had arrived in the East Valley directly. And so I had churches all the time saying they wanted to get involved, and I'm like, I don't have any way to get you involved. There's nothing really. We had a small English class and we had a small tutoring program, but those were the only two things that we had offered, and that was really at Mesa. In October of last year, since October of last year, we've had over 50 families come into the East Valley alone, plus hundreds of families through Central and West. So prior to the 4 years prior to 2021, there were maybe 2,000 refugees that came into the Phoenix area. We were one of the largest welcoming states, again, as I mentioned, but things had really dried up. And last year, there were over 5,000 between Afghan, Cuban, and other resettled communities that came into Phoenix. And so that huge explosion of the numbers of people that came into to the state, I should say 5,000 that came into the state of Arizona, that huge explosion required, again, a more strategic and different approach than just the resettlement agencies. So again, God was in the midst of like helping make connections and build bridges for what we started in the East Valley. But you've just heard from, you know, Palmcroft Church we work with. I was with a group earlier today that's in Peoria, and they are working with one of the families that we support, Surprise. We have several families that are near GCU's campus. So even our organization that was intended to focus in the East Valley and help build bridges in the East Valley and kind of fill gaps there's so much work to be done, and there's so many families in need that we've actually expanded and are working across the entire city. I'd like it to stay city, right? But you know, God has other plans. We'll see where He leads that. But that's the opportunity that exists, right? And what I heard today from the state refugee coordinator, I was at an event this morning and he spoke, and he said we're anticipating potentially as many as 15 to 20,000 new arrivals in the state of Arizona next year, which is higher than we've ever had in 1 year ever. And that is higher than the last probably 10 years combined. So in 1 year, if the numbers grow, so we'll need as many churches, as many community members to come alongside families. Because the sad thing is, most of these families are coming from places around the world that may or may not have the best view of the United States. And they don't choose to come to the U.S. if they're in the refugee program. They get assigned to the U.S., and so they come here because they've been assigned here, unless they have a family connection that brought them. And if they've been assigned to the U.S. and they're fearful of coming because from their perspective, what they hear in the news is our Christian nation, and I say that in quotes because that's their view and perspective of who we are. Some of their view and perspective of who we are as a Christian nation isn't the prettiest view and perspective. Because what they see in the news media is about police killing people, school shootings, people who are dark-skinned not being welcomed and wanted. And so imagine being someone who's coming from another country and culture into a community where you may or may not be welcome. Now, that's a little intimidating at best. And so to have a church that comes alongside and the Christian community come alongside can be really, really powerful and life-changing. Here in Chandler, I had one, he's actually just down the street from the church. He's in an apartment, and I was visiting with him a couple months ago, and he told me, when I was living in Afghanistan, we had people that came from Pakistan and other parts of the other neighboring countries into our community, and our belief was they need to take care of themselves. They got themselves here, they need to figure it out. And he goes, but I've told my dad since being here, I've changed my heart on that. Because what I've seen is the kindness, the generosity, the love, the compassion, just the welcome that we've received here in the United States that's so very different than what we would have done in other places. And he goes, and I can tell you as someone who's new here, who actually knows the language, I need help. I can't do this on my own. If I were trying to do this on my own, I wouldn't survive. I don't know if you paid attention to any of the words I used. Did anybody catch where those words might be found in Scripture? Love, kindness, gentleness.
13. Which is a reflection of all the fruits of the Spirit.
Yes. And so isn't it interesting that our Muslim friends, when we show up as the church and we bring those characteristics and qualities forward, that what they get to actually experience is the love of God that is supposed to be flowing out of us. And that was really, really impactful for me to hear, but just a great reminder of why the church has such an important role to play in this.
When we first met them, I brought my wife over to their house because they needed some help on the computer to do some applications. So I asked them, what's the best thing about America? I said, do you want to go back home? No, we like it here. I said, what's the best thing about here? Security, the peace. They're not, their dad was killed by the Taliban and they're haunted. And the security and peace. So we sang to them, God bless America.
Oh.
And when we got done, they both just kind of bowed their heads and said, God bless America. And then I asked them, what's the worst thing about America? And they both pointed at the wall. It was the neighbor.
Oh, yes. She was not nice.
Yeah, they were from hell.
She was not very welcoming.
Okay.
And I hope she wasn't part of a church because she was not welcoming.
That was funny. And I've had experience with the neighbor, so she is bad.
She's not a fix. But maybe she needs the love of Jesus.
Yeah, we tried.
Demonstrated her. But yeah, it is. It's super powerful to think about the impact it can have. And back in 2016, we had a family. This is when I was at Central, who arrived from Syria. They were Kurdish, and so the community that they were a part of in Mesa, they were a little bit on the outskirts of that community being Kurdish. But they had a welcome team that came around them that were believers, and in 2018, when Turkey started bombing the northern part of Syria and was attacking their particular people group, and their family was fleeing and going into hiding, they were ready to denounce Islam, and they came to their church community that had surrounded them and said, would you pray for us? Again, they needed peace. That was what was missing for them. And They were living in fear. They were fearful for their family. They were angry. And so the church came and we did a prayer meeting in their home. And we prayed with them in their home. And then they said, that felt really good, but we want more of it. And so we brought them to the church. And we had 50 people. So there were 20 people in their home that came to pray with them. And we had 50 people that came to the church and laid hands on them and prayed for them. And that's one of the things that they said is we felt peace for the first time. We experienced what true peace actually is. We want more of that because it sounds like it's something that Jesus gives and we want to know who he is. So over the course of that next year, the pastor, our global outreach pastor, worked with them and did DMM with them, or did Discovery Bible Study with them in Arabic and a little bit of Kurdish, trying to get to their heart language, and shared more about who Jesus was. And in 2019, in March of that year, they announced that, little did we know, they were sharing everything they were learning with family back in Turkey. And their family back in Turkey had been baptized as believers. And they chose to be baptized then in April of 2019. And so again, that's the power and opportunity of the church coming alongside. No one in that community group was trying to force them into a relationship with Jesus. But when the opportunity came and when the need was there for something different than what they had known, and they asked for prayer, and again, we can tell our friends that we pray for them. They understand prayer and they know that that's a powerful thing. So they knew to ask for prayer. They said, will you pray for us? And so they offered that, we can't do anything to change the circumstances for your family in Syria right now. We don't have the power in our own political realms, but what we do have power to do is pray, and God has the power to change things in that place. So those are some of the opportunities that exist, and it's why we have a heart for bringing the church alongside families, so that when they get into moments of crisis or they just need support and help, that they have people who can befriend them, people who care about them, and family or a community that they can call family, because they've often lost their family from home. So those are just a few of the stories. I'm sure Marcel could share stories as well of impact she's seeing. You obviously are seeing some impact stories with the family that you're working with, and I know, Jimmy, you're going to see some more impact stories with Kaputa and Kasmiel as well, and their extended family here. But and I look forward to the stories that you see. But we're at time, so I want to be sensitive and ask any, if you have a question, anything that I can help answer for you, I'd be happy to connect you personally. On the back side of this sheet, it gives some how to personalize this, right? Like, what thing are you going to take as your next step action from this workshop? And hopefully I covered the things that you were looking for. If you're looking to get connected to refugee families, again, if it's not through Matthew House, I do have other organizations that I can help connect you to that you might find families. If you're looking for organizations to connect to, I can help connect you to organizations where that may be impactful. And I can do some research for Florida and see what might exist there. But the first thing I would encourage you to just look and see who the resettlement agencies are. And then the other thing I always encourage is ask some schools if they have children that need to learn the language, because any school that is doing ESL lessons probably has refugee and immigrant children in their community, and when you care for someone's children, it's a great entry point to then care for the family of that child. So connecting through the school sometimes is a great way to build a bridge. Thank you guys so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you for the work that you're doing. Thank you for the work that you're doing. I appreciate it. Thank you guys for being here. And hopefully we'll see a work in Levine someday.
Right?
Because it continues to expand and grow out there. And I know that you'll see a work at JC. There's a lot of opportunity in your area.